Good morning. I'm Brian Curtis.
And I'm Doug Krisner. Here are the stories we're following today.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ruled out a ceasefire, and he has refused to resign, which the opposition has been imploring him to do. Let's get to Ed Baxter in San Francisco with all the latest. Ed?
Yeah, that's right, Brian. And this with a backdrop of intensified ground operations in Gaza, tanks penetrating deep into Gaza, and Israeli forces raiding a West Bank, exchanging fire with Hezbollah across the Lebanese border. Netanyahu defiant today and addressing the nation and the media.
I want to make clear Israel's position regarding a ceasefire. Just as the United States would not agree to a ceasefire after the bombing of Pearl Harbor or after the terrorist attack of 9/11, Israel will not agree to a cessation of hostilities with Hamas after the horrific attacks of October 7th. Calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to terrorism, to surrender to barbarism. That will not happen.
And says he will not resign.
The only thing that I intend to have resign is Hamas. We're going to resign them to the dustbin of history. That's my goal. That's my responsibility. And that's what I'm leading the country to do.
And Netanyahu says this is a turning point, the decision to fight or surrender to tyranny. House Republicans are taking their own path to aid on Israel. House Republicans introducing a $14.3 billion aid plan. The package separates Israel aid from a broader Biden emergency funding request that includes Ukraine and Taiwan. Bloomberg's Jonathan Tomeri says it's an interesting question about separating them and whether aid to Ukraine now will pass.
The Republicans only want to put up bills that have a majority of Republican support. And that's where the question comes in on Ukraine, is that there's been a lot of skepticism among some segments of Republicans towards Ukraine aid. And so that bill would get enough support, I think, from Republicans and Democrats.
Now, the House bill pays for the Israel aid by cutting the Biden Inflation Reduction Act, calling for a $14.3 billion reduction in funding for the IRS. In the U.S., White House says it is getting reports of a rise in anti-Semitic incidents. National Security spokesman John Kirby says the administration has doubled down on its commitment to protect the Jewish community.
It's a deep concern, which is why we as an administration are working so closely with state and local authorities to make sure we can identify any threats and disrupt them before they happen.
And Kirby says there's no place for it in America. Saudi forces say they are on high alert after a clash with Houthi rebels. 4 Saudi soldiers died in clashes in the Jazan province on the border with Yemen. The Houthis also tried to fire a missile over the kingdom toward Israel. And with a settlement between GM and the UAW today, all of the big three are getting ready to go back to work full force, and President Joe Biden says a majority victory for both sides.
These record agreements reward auto workers who gave up much to keep the industry working and going during the financial crisis more than a decade ago. These agreements ensure the iconic Big Three can still lead the world in quality and innovation.
Biden says building the economy from the middle out. More details on the deal itself coming up very shortly here on Bloomberg. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. In San Francisco, I'm Ed Baxter, and this is Bloomberg. Brian?
Ed, thanks very much. Doug Krisner and I will take a look at some of the top stories, and Paul Allen will be joining us in a few moments on the show as well. Well, General Motors says it has reached a tentative agreement with United Auto Workers to end its strike. The strike has run 6 weeks. We hear the deal includes a 25% hourly pay raise plus cost of living allowances over more than 4 years of the contract. We spoke earlier with Bloomberg's David Welch, who says there's still more work ahead.
These contracts do actually take some time to kind of get ratified and that sort of thing. You know, and there will be this sort of almost Byzantine process where they go about, trying to get everything ratified. And, once that process is in place, then the companies can kind of start looking at, where they're going to invest and how quickly they're going to ramp things up. And I think that's, it's going to be tough for them to do, just kind of cranking up EV production and all this other stuff. It just takes a little bit of time to turn the ignition on these things.
That's Bloomberg's David Welch. Separately, UAW officials are now urging all unions in the U.S. to prepare for strikes on May Day of 2028. That's when the latest proposed contracts with the big three automakers are set to expire.
Trick or treat from Apple? Well, we're about to find out. The tech giant is rolling out some new products on the eve of Halloween. Here's Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow.
In the event dubbed Scary Fast, we're expecting a big focus on Mac, a new iMac according to Bloomberg's reporting, and an updated version of a high-end MacBook Pro. We also expect Apple to debut its latest generation silicon, the M3 chip, its PC processor, then move forward to Thursday when we get Apple earnings. The expectation is that overall we see a fourth consecutive quarter of sales decline for Apple.
That is Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. By the way, Apple shares were up 1% today, and that Scary Fast event will kick off at 8 p.m. Wall Street time, and of course, we'll be monitoring it for you. Brian?
Well, the U.S. Treasury cut its net borrowing estimate for the current quarter from $852 to $776 billion. Now, this offers some relief to investors who are concerned about the rapidly widening fiscal deficit. Treasury officials said part of the reason for the smaller figure is the magnitude of deferred tax receipts coming from areas of California and other states. These states have been granted extensions due to natural disasters. And we've been talking for the past week or so about the refunding announcement on Wednesday. That's when we'll find out how this money is spread across the various tenors of those bonds being sold. Doug?
Well, President Biden today signed an executive order on artificial intelligence. This will establish standards for both security and privacy protections. The order will have obviously broad impacts on companies developing AI tools. They will be required to first safety test new models before releasing them to the public. Here is the president on the order.
One thing is clear. To realize the promise of AI and avoid the risk, we need to govern this technology, and there's no other way around it, in my view. It must be governed.
That is President Biden. Now, he went on to say that he will meet Tuesday with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and lawmakers from both parties at the White House. They will discuss AI and passing legislation on privacy concerns. Brian?
We saw a pop in the yen. Dollar yen here, 149.06 at the moment. Policymakers at the Bank of Japan are considering letting 10-year bond yields top the 1% mark. Bloomberg's Joanne Wong has more.
The Bank of Japan is set to consider a further tweaking of its yield curve control policy at its meeting today. The Nikkei newspaper says the central bank is likely to allow further flexibility in yield movements. The BOJ is likely to consider allowing 10-year JGB yields to rise above 1% by modifying its fixed rate buying operations. The move may prevent the bank from having to buy large amounts of long-term debt. The yen strengthened against the dollar after the report. 10-year swap rates also received a boost. Upward pressure on yields has been stronger than what BOJ Governor Kazuo Ueda had expected. In Hong Kong, I'm Joanne Wong, Bloomberg Radio.
Well, later today, we'll get China's official readings on the PMI, and analysts are expecting these data to show a brief lull in China's recovery. You'll have to remember the 8-day holiday at the beginning of the month, yes, and that's likely to be behind this anticipated setback. Bloomberg Economics is projecting the official manufacturing PMI to slip to a reading of 49.9. That would be down from 50.2 in September and would be the first drop that we have seen since May. At the same time, the non-manufacturing PMI is expected to ease to a reading of 51. That would be down from 51.7, by the way. Separately, the private Caixin manufacturing PMI could move in the other direction, and that's because there is a different seasonal adjustment method used in that calculation.
I'm Brian Curtis, along with Paul Allen, and this is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia. Our guest is Jody Schneider, political news director for Bloomberg Television and Radio, with us to look more closely at the Israel-Hamas war. Jody, Israel is definitely facing more pressure to focus on humanitarian considerations, and so that's one thing. Markets have been a little bit buoyant here in the past 24 hours, yet at the same time, as we heard from Ed, Israeli forces have raided a city in the West Bank. They've exchanged fire with Hezbollah across the Lebanese border and also conducted an airstrike in Syria. So it seems that we have both restraint and escalation, which seems a little oxymoronic, but I guess that's war.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we're seeing, Brian. We're seeing both on the U.S. forces, U.S. and allied forces, telling us that Israel is moving ahead with this next phase, and even as the UN warns that this war is spreading and this humanitarian crisis, Israel is promising more aid, even as it steps up those attacks. Ron Dermer, the Strategic Affairs Minister, told us that the aid shipments to Gaza are set to pick up somewhat, 100 trucks a day of aid starting tomorrow or Wednesday, which, of course, at this stage, is still a proverbial drop in the bucket. But they said they expect that, and they expect that to continue. Dermer also said that the next several days should see the lowest number of civilian casualties of war, which is an interesting statement to make, though he acknowledged that unanticipated effects may affect the outlook. So this is what Israel has had a lot of criticism for, is the civilians, the large number of civilians that have died as they have gone further into Gaza. And this is something that the U.S. has also been concerned about and has been urging Israel to think of different strategies as it goes into Gaza, given the civilian and the whole humanitarian crisis that is occurring there.
We were hearing from Benjamin Netanyahu earlier at Baxter's newscast, and he's pushing back on suggestions that he resign over the security breach that started this whole conflict. How strong is his position right now? Is he likely to see out this entire conflict?
Yeah, hard to know, Paul. But one of the things that, of course, provoked these questions was over the weekend, the Prime Minister criticized when asked, was actually criticized the army, criticized for some of the armed forces there for some of the intelligence failures, and that was very that went online and very quickly taken down, and then he apologized. But there's a lot of anger in Israel over how this intelligence failure occurred, and a lot of it directed toward him and his government, given that he had really been pushing for this so-called judicial reform, and had been focusing on that rather than military matters. So some found it very ironic that he was then pointing the finger at the military itself. So when this is what provoked these questions today, but he came out and made it very clear he's not resigning, making that statement, the only thing I intend to have resign is Hamas. So it looks like for now he has no intention of doing that. It is a war cabinet he is in right now. Yeah. They're not doing anything except military-related activities, taking up no other matters.
Well, he always does defiance very well, Benjamin Netanyahu. From the U.S. Point of view, U.S. forces have been attacked by Iran-backed militias, and we had a senior defense official saying it was 23 times since October 17th, yet most of the attacks failed to hit their targets. So is the U.S. approaching this from, well, it's terrible that we've been attacked so many times, or it's actually good because these militias are not very good in getting their targets to hit the mark?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, actually. I mean, they're obviously relieved that most of these attacks did fail to hit those targets. But the bigger concern is this escalation of the Israel-Hamas war. And as we know, last week the U.S. conducted strikes on 2 facilities in Syria that the administration is concerned are used by groups affiliated with Iranian forces. And, of course, we've heard, from the Syrian side, there's concerns. There's concerns about Hezbollah in the north. So this is the real worry from the U.S., that this could get out of control, and out of control pretty quickly.
You mentioned the procession of aid into Gaza a moment ago. We've only got about 30 seconds left, but what about the opportunities for refugees to get out? That's still not really an option, is it?
Not really. This is a huge problem, and this is what's leading the UN and relief organizations to be very, very concerned, because people in Gaza are basically stuck there for the time being.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, your morning brief on the stories making news from Hong Kong to Singapore and Wall Street.
Look for us on your podcast feed every day on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcast.
You can also listen live each day on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, Sirius XM Channel 119, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Brian Curtis.
And I'm Doug Krisner. Join us again tomorrow for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Asia.